Ahead of Resident Evil 5's release in 2009, a dark cloud swirled above the game with particular ferocity. It was a cloud made up of allegations that the game was, and by extension still is to this day, racist. There has been renewed interest and much discussion of that topic recently, in part because it's likely 5 will be the series' next title to receive a remake following the success of 4's, but also because of an article published by IGN a few weeks ago which briefly touched on it. Having coincidentally finished a playthrough of Resident Evil 5 myself around the same time, and as a series superfan, it's a subject I also find fascinating and have been thinking about a lot since, so I thought I'd share my opinion while everything remains fresh in my mind. Also, regardless of where you land on this issue, reasonable, level-headed critiques of topics like this are vital, and as adults we should be able to debate them without malice, so please try and keep it civil in the comments. Right, now before going any further, I think it's important that I share my own view early on, especially when tackling a matter as divisive as this one. To be particularly blunt, yes, I think there are aspects of Resident Evil 5 which are problematic, if not racist. Now, what I'm not suggesting in any way is that there was any deliberate maliciousness on Capcom's part. The examples I'm about to share can mostly be chalked up to a lack of sensitivity. However, regardless of intent, the optics can undoubtedly at times be poor. For those of you unfamiliar with the premise, Chris Redfield and new partner Sheva Alomar, both part of the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or BSAA for short, are sent to the fictional city of Kajuju in West Africa to investigate an outbreak.
Freeze!
Not long after arriving, they are set upon by hordes of angry locals infected with the Plaga parasite, and so begins a struggle for survival in an unfamiliar setting. If that sounds a lot like Resident Evil 4's story, that's because it is, and it's that similarity which is often used as the primary argument against accusations levied at 5. Usually, it's something along the lines of, the first few Resident Evils were set in America, and Leon killed parasite-infected Spaniards by the truckload in 4, with neither causing any uproar, so why should a game which uses Africa as a setting and features parasite-infected Africans be any more or less controversial than those titles? Simplifying discourse to that extent is at best overly reductive and at worst intellectually dishonest. It used to be Spaniards and now it's Africans, why bad, removes any nuance whatsoever, and the details here are very important. The difference between Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5 is rooted in Africa's colonial past and the unsettling historical underpinnings which accompany it. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Scramble for Africa occurred, a race between mostly European nations to occupy as much of the continent as they could without coming into direct conflict with one another. It saddens me to say that the United Kingdom managed to grab the largest share, with France not far behind, but they were by no means the only two countries involved. Decolonisation began proper in the early 1950s and continued for several decades, which means there are people alive today who lived through the process and many more who are still reeling from the lasting effects of unwanted Western influence. To put it simply, the wounds are still relatively fresh. What has that got to do with Resident Evil 5, I hear you ask? Well, there's a phrase you might have heard used to refer to Africa, the Dark Continent. First popularised by explorer Henry M. Stanley in his book Through the Dark Continent, it was a phrase which conjured up the impression that Africa was an unexplored, mysterious locale. Language is a powerful thing, however, and what the Dark Continent also helped many propagate was the idea of Africa being a dangerous, untamed land filled with savages, a place which colonisation would only serve to benefit. This idea reared its ugly head in many forms, especially in literature, cartoons and similar. I'm not going to show you examples on screen as I'm a big girl's blouse and I'd like to avoid being thrown in YouTube jail, but I'd suggest reading up on works such as Joseph Conrad's 1899 novel Heart of Darkness, one I actually studied myself at university, or Serge's 1930 comic Tintin in the Congo. The point I'm trying to make is, Africa and the people who lived there were subject to some pretty awful depictions in literature and other media fairly recently, and as such it's important that we are aware of them and actively try to avoid further promoting them in the present. As a side note, it could be argued that we've not managed to completely escape the practice in the here and now either. I'd say a lot more of the Western films involving Africa I've seen feature gun-toting soldiers, dangerous surroundings and the like, with far less of them shining a light on the positive aspects of the many countries and cultures which exist within it. Looking at specific examples featured in 5, I personally think Capcom is incredibly careless in the way it deploys its imagery. The group beating what can only be presumed to be another person in a sack to death, the megaphone-wielding leader riling up a baying mob, the execution which follows, its relentlessness feels like a modern twist on the Dark Continent idea. The single Western woman who appears outside the main cast, a blonde-haired, provocatively dressed American being dragged away by scary locals, isn't a great look either. I want to return quickly to what I said earlier, that Capcom wasn't being deliberately malicious, because I really don't think they were. If you were to ask me what mantra I think they adhered to when creating these early parts of 5, I'd say it was probably little more than do Resident Evil 4 again, but in Africa. Look at the early village set piece, for example. In 5, you hold off an onslaught of Mangini, the name for those infected, in a large area, and then do your best to avoid a stronger enemy wielding an axe. Compare that to Leon, who fights Ganado in a large area before he's rushed by a stronger foe, wielding a chainsaw. They are practically identical, and I'm not convinced there was much consideration of anything else beyond that. If there's one part of the game which I think proves that point, it's Chapter 3. The tribesmen are a ridiculous stereotype, to the point I can't see there being any other explanation than that Capcom did not understand why someone would find them offensive. Their outfits, them wielding spears, the whole shebang. I find it difficult to believe that even 15 years ago a Western developer would have designed similar. There is in-world cause for what happened. The Type 3 Plagas field test and Village Youth's file allude to the males of the Endopia tribe behaving like their ancestors due to infection, but Capcom giving a reason for their existence does not absolve them of responsibility, especially when that reasoning is so flimsy to begin with. Simply justifying their presence is not good enough. You also have to be very careful about how you present them. It should also be noted that Capcom actually put an embargo on this particular portion of the game for reviewers in 2009, with them not being allowed to talk about it until after Resident Evil 5 had launched. Also, prior to release, they did diversify the enemies you come up against compared to the groups shown in early trailers. There is evidence that they were actively listening, or were at least aware to some degree of the issues, and that's good news in the present, because Resident Evil 5 is by no means a lost cause in remake terms. Instead, it's a fantastic opportunity to sand down some of the game's rougher edges. In addition to putting some more thought into the imagery used throughout, a remake would be a great opportunity to better flesh out the anti-colonial thread that bubbles underneath 5's surface. As you progress, it's made very clear that influence by Western pharmaceutical companies are the cause of most of the problems, and Capcom leaning harder into that side of things would be most welcome. Equally, Sheva being better fleshed out with more attention paid to her history and her thoughts regarding what's occurred would help too. Much of her dialogue in the original focuses on Chris and his relationship with former colleague Jill Valentine and Nemesis Wesker, rather than on her dismay at what has unfolded in her homeland. That would be a much more interesting thread to pull at in a remake. Also, let's maybe make the introductory shot of her something other than the camera zooming in on her arse, Capcom? Given the level of discourse, I'm reasonably confident Capcom will have learnt their lesson by the time a remake approaches, but at the same time, I'd also say it's no sure thing, given that fairly recently there was concept art of Street Fighter's Balrog wearing a gorilla suit being produced. I also want to throw in one last time that I truly and wholeheartedly believe that what we got in Resident Evil 5 was the result of Capcom being extremely insensitive rather than deliberately offensive. But if they are to remake Resident Evil 5 as they have done with other titles in recent years, a huge amount of thought needs to be put into how an updated version is handled. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and stars members. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts, and fingers crossed I'll catch you again soon.